The problem with declaring someone to be a legend is that a myth inevitably catches up with them. This is the Righteous Bojambo, and it's time to talk about Bessie Smith. Imagine a railway siding in Turner, Mississippi, on a mild February evening in 1903. A well-dressed black man shifts listlessly as he tries to catch a furtive nap on a bench, his baggage for a pillow, a cornet case tucked tightly under his arm. His hope of sleep is dashed as, further down the bench, another man takes a seat and proceeds to pick at a guitar. Our hero, endlessly curious about new musical sounds, rises to observe him. Thereupon he sees and describes a lean, loose-jointed Negro who had commenced plucking at a guitar beside me while I slept. His clothes were rags, his feet peeped out of his shoes. His face had on it some of the sadness of the ages. As he played, he pressed a knife on the strings in a manner popularized by Hawaiian guitarists who used steel bars. The effect was unforgettable. His song, too, struck me instantly. The singer repeated the line, "Going where the Southern crossed the yellow dog," 3 times, accompanying himself on the guitar with the weirdest music I had ever heard. Thus, the local black folk music, unwritten and loosely defined in style, came into contact with one of the most inventive, disciplined, yet troubled musical minds of its generation. This is where W.C. Handy met the blues. To be strictly correct, he didn't meet the blues. The blues came to be a musical term about a half a dozen years later, and Handy didn't use the term himself for another 10. But he heard what we would recognise, dimly, as the blues, and that's as the myth would have it. Handy, a man as devoted to making money as he was music, perhaps more so given that he gave up music on a number of occasions for better paying civilian jobs, no doubt saw and heard something unique and marketable in this obscure regional sound. But it was 6 years before he put his new music into form when he composed an early version of what was to become Memphis Blues as a campaign song for the incumbent mayor of Memphis. Handy noted the success of the song, and the crowds listening to it started to write their own words to it, all of which seemed to revolve around the phrase Memphis Blues. By 1912, Handy had rewritten the melody and, most importantly, copyrighted the song, taking it from an obscure local form to a potentially much wider audience. The next step was even greater. Judging by the 1916 recording of it by the Victor Military Band, Handy's vision of the blues was a much more sophisticated and musically literate version of what he'd heard on that lonesome railway stop, bearing a distinct Latin influence which was a hallmark of most early blues. It is very possibly a nod to New Orleans, which had a strong Latin influence to it via being the primary port for incoming Cuban trade, and was seen as a much more musically sophisticated and refined influence than rural Mississippi. Handy, both as a musical snob and a man who, for a black person, sure didn't seem to care very much for black people, was always trying to make black music respectable. Thus was set the template for the blues for the earliest years of its development as a written and recorded form, and one which went unchallenged until the mid-1920s, when the big city labels started sending out field scouts and finding local equivalents of the Raggedy Man of Turner. In the Carolinas, Georgia, Arkansas, Texas, and almost as an afterthought, the home of the Raggedy Man, Mississippi. It was there that the obscure local forms which represented the true diversity of what was blanketed as the blues were discovered. The obscure local forms as they were broadening their audience as well, only more slowly. In 1912, a feisty young belter out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, Bessie Smith, joined a travelling troupe of musicians run by a gentleman called Moses Stokes. Her brother Clarence was part of the troupe, and its star was the formidable Gertrude Ma Rainey. Rainey took Smith under her wing and schooled her in the blues and stagecraft. After moving on from Stokes's troupe, Smith based herself out of Atlanta, where she worked in chorus lines before striking out in 1918 as a solo artist once she'd moved to the notorious TOBA, a black-owned black book agency who stole from their artists every chance they got. Rainey said that TOBA stood for Tough on Black Asses. Soon she'd surpassed Rainey as the premier singer of the new blues music. Her ability to project with volume while still being able to shade her vocal, her rough, tough, take-no-shit stage presence and her unbounded energy, her trademark apparently, was to spit on stage. Ew. Made her a huge star, to the point where she became the highest paid black entertainer in the land, travelling in her own private rail car and acting as her own promoter. As Smith's star was ascending, in 1920, OK Records in New York released Mamie, no relation, Smith's Crazy Blues, the first record written, played on and sung by all black artists. Mamie Smith's two previous sides were pop songs written by W.C. Handy. Selling over 100,000 copies, which was a great deal for those times, record companies immediately saw a new market and began to sweep up female blues singers. Alberta Hunter was recording on Black Swan in May 1921 and made the leap to the majors with Paramount by early 1922. Ma Rainey was snatched up by Paramount and held sessions at the end of 1923, and Bessie Smith was in the studio by herself in February 1923. In all, she cut 152 sides for Columbia and a further 4 at the end of her career for OK. Of those Columbia recordings, she put 3 in the Grammy Hall of Fame: Downhearted Blues, Empty Bed Blues, and St. Louis Blues. St. Louis Blues is considered to be the song to which Bessie Smith is most closely tethered, and rightly so, for while she had earlier, later and bigger hits, this is the record that stands by itself in the canon of American recorded music as a masterwork, representing as it does both the power of innovative arrangement and of the singer's pure craft. The song itself is just about as old as the written blues is. Written by Handy in 1914, it's been recorded many hundreds of times in many varieties of arrangements. So much so that it, as a touchstone of blues, has been called the Hamlet of Jazz. Original arrangements and the earliest recordings have a strong Latin influence, including a tango introduction originally written by Handy. But Smith strips all of this away, relying only on Fred Longshaw's baleful harmonium and the great Louis Armstrong's cry-inflected cornet lines, returning this to the elemental simplicity from which, our perspective, we associate with the blues. And then there's Smith's vocal, an object lesson in light and shade, if not the object lesson in light and shade. Again, the performance reduces rather than embellishes and achieves more by doing it. The vocal for St. Louis Blues is all the more remarkable given that it was not recorded with an electric microphone. Smith didn't use electric recording until she recorded Careless Love 4 months later. It shows her complete mastery of vocal textures and her ability to get inside a song and bring its remarkable and earthy lyric to life. More than anyone else, it was Smith that turned the blues into a viable business. She sold 6 million records in her first 4 years on Columbia, and all this without ever having set foot west of the Rocky Mountains. She reconnected the blues with the everyday worries, fears, and sadnesses of black people. She was the Raggedy Man of Turner for her day. But all the time she pandered to the aspirations of the audience for a carefree life, dancing the hoochie coo in a sequin gown to packed houses, night after night. She understood this because she had suffered as they had. She'd been born into abysmal poverty, horsewhipped and run out of town by segregationists. Her record company paid her no royalties on her sales, but they did pay $200 a side, which was the highest rate that anyone in the business got in those days. Her relatives robbed her blind, and she was even stabbed in the stomach by a crazy fan. She suffered and made others suffer in other ways. She was a violent alcoholic who once literally ripped most of the hair out of the head of a woman she believed her common-law husband was cheating with, while she was cheating on him. She spent plenty of time in jail for assaults, disorderly conduct and illegal drinking. Yet Smith went on to greater triumphs in her career. Shows, hit records, movies, a movie called tellingly St. Louis Blues, and eternal enshrinement as the Empress of the Blues. As the Depression loomed and the blues boom waned, Smith began to retarget her songs towards jazz, pop and even folk recordings. But in the end, she came to the end of the road with Columbia and went back onto the road. Again, in reduced circumstances, but still as big a draw and as hot a show as ever there was. After 4 years out of contract, she accepted $150 to cut 4 remarkable sides for OK in 1934. Do Your Duty and Give Me a Pig Foot and a Bottle of Beer are 2 of the finest pieces in her catalogue. But her legend was well enshrined by then. Strangely, the last 2 sides she cut for OK were on Friday the 24th of November 1933. On the following Monday, Billie Holiday made her first ever recordings. A baton had been passed. Bessie Smith is a titanic figure in American popular music. Had she not emerged, it may have been that the blues and all it influenced would be mere sideshows in the carnival of the world's music. Or perhaps the gifted Alberta Hunter would have taken her place. Or Ma Rainey roused her energy to claim a similar primacy amongst blues singers. Or Mamie Smith would have capitalised on her breakthrough success instead of heading back to vaudeville. But talented as these performers were and fine as the records they made may have been, none of them were Bessie Smith. She was the whole package, perfect fusion of talent, technique, presentation and personality. If it were only for her pioneering work in studio technique, making the electric microphone an expressive instrument, which predated Bing Crosby's work by a year, she would have been a major figure and owed a debt by all who came after her. Her story came to a gruesome end in 1937, dying of injuries sustained in a car wreck outside Clarksdale, Mississippi. Clarksdale, birthplace of Sam Cooke, John Lee Hooker and Ike Turner, where the Empress of the Blues departed this mortal coil, in a hospital less than a mile from the crossroads where Robert Johnson allegedly sold his soul to the devil, and not 60 miles from where it all began, where the Southern crosses the Yellow Dog. Guten Morgen, meine Freunde. I hope you found today's presentation to be interesting and that it piqued your curiosity. What piques my curiosity is your response to not only the music of Bessie Smith, which you can find in the playlist associated with this video, but also generally the jazz and the blues of the 1920s. What's your level of familiarity with it? Who are your favourites? What do you think the most influential pieces are? That would be fascinating for us to know and discuss. So, meditating upon that, perhaps over a cool beverage and a plate of biscuits, we'll wait until next time we meet together in good company, or until the nasty YouTube police shut the channel down. And in that meantime, you keep listening to the good stuff, and you stay righteous. Oh, we've started, have we?
I did that.
Oh, you did. I have to give you that. I thought we did.
Okay. Well, that'll be the cutting point. 5, 4,